The storm never ended on Virelia. It rolled across the horizon like a wounded beast, swallowing light, sand, and sound until all that remained was a grinding symphony of metal and wind. Lyra Hale pulled her respirator tighter, her boots sinking into the fine, glassy grit that used to be soil before the reactors had scorched it a century ago. She moved carefully through the ruins of the old mining outpost, her scanner humming faintly at her hip, picking up traces of functioning tech buried beneath collapsed towers. Every few meters, she stopped to listen, not for predators, but for the strange, rhythmic pulse that traveled through the wreckage. It was mechanical, faint, yet alive. She followed it down a narrow shaft half swallowed by debris, the stale air inside the tunnel flickering with the pale green light of her wrist lamp. The pulse grew stronger, a soft metallic heartbeat echoing behind the shattered walls. She expected a power cell, maybe an old drone, but when she pried open the hatch with her crowbar, she froze. Inside a rusted containment cage, curled like a dying ember, was a small creature. Wings folded tight, scales dull to a pale bronze, a faint shimmer of circuitry pulsing beneath its skin. Its eyes opened slowly, reflecting the green of her lamp, and for an instant Lyra thought she saw intelligence behind the fear. The label on the cage was half buried under dust, but one word was still legible: useless. Lyra crouched beside it, wiping the grime from the metal. The creature hissed weakly, a puff of smoke escaping its nostrils before it collapsed again, trembling. A microchip collar blinked at its throat, still active, sending out a distress signal on an old Dominion frequency. If patrol drones picked it up, they'd be here within the hour. Her instincts screamed to leave it, anything carrying that tag meant trouble. But the small rise and fall of its chest, the soft, pained sound it made, cracked through her resolve like lightning through glass. "Easy," she whispered, her voice muffled by the respirator. "I'm not one of them." She slid her blade through the rusted locks, sparks flashing in the darkness. The collar sparked once, twice, then released with a mechanical sigh. The creature gasped, a sound that wasn't entirely animal, and tried to stand, but its legs buckled. Lyra reached out without thinking, catching it before it fell. Its skin was warm, almost feverish, and the faint hum beneath its scales reminded her of the drone engines she scavenged every day. But this was no machine. This was alive, and old, and wrong for this dying world. When she lifted it, its small heart thudded against her chest, faster and faster, sinking with her own. Outside, thunder rumbled through the canyons. Lyra wrapped the creature in her thermal cloak and began the long climb back to the surface. Above them, through the boiling clouds, flashes of silver moved, Dominion patrols searching for signals. She shut off her scanner, clutching the fragile life closer. For the first time in years, she wasn't scavenging for survival. She was protecting something, something the world had already given up on. The creature slept for 2 days, breathing shallowly beneath the torn emergency blanket while the storm outside battered the steel shelter. Lyra had sealed the entrance with magnetic locks, but each gust still made the walls shudder. She spent the hours dismantling scavenged parts, building a weak energy barrier around the room to mask their heat signatures from Dominion scanners. Every few minutes she glanced at the creature, at the tiny movements of its chest, the faint sparks crawling under its scales like trapped lightning. It wasn't natural. It wasn't supposed to exist anymore. And yet, it did. When it finally stirred, the light in its eyes was no longer dull. The pupils slid into vertical lines, gold radiating outward like the flare of a reactor core. Lyra froze mid-motion. The creature, no, the dragon, lifted its head slowly, trembling, wings half unfolded. A shimmer of energy rippled through the air, making her tools vibrate on the table. Then a voice came, not from its mouth, but directly into her thoughts. "Where am I?" Lyra almost dropped the plasma torch. "You're safe," she said, though the word felt fragile here. "You were trapped. I got you out." The dragon blinked. It looked around the dim shelter, at the flickering lights, at her patched armor and tired face. "You are human. The thought carried a faint distortion, like an echo transmitted through damaged circuits. Last time I checked, she muttered. And you're supposed to be extinct. Its head tilted, the metal veins along its neck glowing faintly blue. Extinct. Yes. That is what they wanted. Lyra leaned forward. Who are you? The creature hesitated, as if the answer carried weight. Kale Youth, it said finally. The sound of the name vibrated through the air like a tuning fork. Designation Guardian Class, Elemental Flight Division, long ago. Lyra frowned. Guardian Class. She'd seen the term before, buried in old Dominion archives. They were synthetic biohybrids engineered to regulate planetary climates before the wars turned them into weapons. You were built, she said quietly. Kale Youth's eyes narrowed. Born. Then built upon. He spread his wings weakly, each joint marked with faint seams of alloy and scar tissue. They called us storms given shape. Until we refused their chains. The silence between them hummed with static. Lyra reached for the data pad beside her bed, scanning his body's readings. The biological and mechanical signatures tangled together, impossible to separate. His core temperature was dropping again. She activated a heat coil beneath him, the soft red light painting his scales in molten color. Why save me? He asked. I am nothing to your kind but a myth, or a warning. Lyra stared at the flames dancing in the portable heater. Maybe because I know what it's like to be thrown away. Kale Youth watched her closely. Then we are both exiles. His tone shifted, softer, almost curious. But exiles can still burn. Outside, the storm thickened, and for the first time in her life, Lyra felt a pulse of warmth spread through the cold metal walls. It wasn't from the heater. It was from the dragon's faint, growing light. By the seventh day, Kale Youth was strong enough to stand on his own. His wings still hung unevenly, but the torn membranes shimmered faintly with new growth, a synthesis of organic tissue and the nanofibers Lyra had threaded into the wounds. She hadn't intended to repair him like a machine, yet it felt natural, the rhythm of soldering energy veins matching the pulse of his heart. The dragon absorbed electricity like breath. When she rerouted a cracked fusion core to warm the shelter, Kale Youth had curled beside it and sighed, scales flickering in patterns that resembled constellations. He wasn't just recovering. He was remembering himself. Lyra spent the daylight hours scavenging. The Dominion's aerial patrols had begun sweeping closer, metallic shadows slicing through the yellow haze above the canyon rim. She moved carefully, staying beneath the magnetic interference fields, her mind echoing with Kale Youth's faint presence. Their connection wasn't deliberate, it had started the night he first spoke, a low hum in the back of her thoughts, an ancient frequency that refused to fade. At times she caught glimpses that weren't hers, open skies, vast fires, the sound of wings like thunder. When she returned from a scavenging run, Kale Youth stood near the entrance, staring through the reinforced glass at the storm beyond. They are looking for us, he said, his thoughts sharp, resonant. The Dominion hunts what it fears. Lyra dropped her pack with a thud. They don't even believe you exist anymore. They just see a heat signature. He turned to her, golden eyes luminous. Belief is irrelevant to predators. She wanted to argue, but the ground shuddered, distant but steady. She activated the radar display. Multiple contacts. Metallic. Moving fast. Dominion drones, swarm class. She cursed under her breath and started sealing the power nodes. Kale Youth stepped forward. Let me handle it. You can barely fly. Then I will crawl faster than they can think. Before she could stop him, he pushed open the outer hatch. The storm roared in, and Lyra's visor flickered from static interference. Through the distortion, she saw Kale Youth climb onto the ledge, his small frame outlined by the crackling light of the sandstorm. The first drone descended, its plasma core glowing cold blue. Kale Youth raised his head, and exhaled. The air shimmered. A focused arc of heat lanced through the storm, cutting the drone cleanly in two. The others scattered, firing blindly. Lyra grabbed her rifle, but the fight was already ending. One by one, their signals vanished from her scanner, their hulls falling in molten fragments that hissed as they hit the sand. When silence returned, Kale Youth turned toward her. Smoke coiled from his nostrils, his wings flickering with power he hadn't shown before. Useless, he said bitterly, voice trembling through her mind. That was the name they gave me. Lyra stared at him, her heart still racing. Not anymore. He lowered his head slightly, as if uncertain whether she spoke to reassure him, or to remind herself. The storm raged on, but somewhere high above, beyond the veil of ash and lightning, a sliver of clear sky waited. Neither of them had seen it yet, but both felt it calling. They flew for the first time that night, not far, not high, just enough to escape the heat signatures of the Dominion patrols sweeping the lower canyons. Lyra clung to the harness she had improvised from the straps of her scavenger gear, her body pressed against Kelyutha's scaled back as the storm swallowed them. The wind howled through the ruined cliffs, scattering shards of glass like frozen fire. Beneath them, the old mines of Virelia pulsed faintly with reactor light, a heartbeat buried in the planet's bones. Kelyutha's wings trembled under the strain, his breath rasping through his teeth. Higher, Lyra urged, her voice half lost in the storm. He growled, not from anger, but effort, and pushed upward. The turbulence tore at them, the air so thin it stung her lungs, but then the storm broke apart, and for the first time in her life, Lyra saw the sky. It wasn't black as she had imagined, it was silver, veined with drifting auroras and faint traces of orbital debris that glittered like falling stars. Above the horizon, suspended on massive graviton rings, hung Celium, the Dominion's floating fortress, the capital of their empire, and the source of every order that had turned her world into ash. Its underside glowed with the energy of enslaved reactors, chains of light binding the clouds beneath it. Kelyutha's wings faltered, and they dipped lower, gliding toward the shadow of a ruined transport carrier half buried in the storm. They landed hard, metal shrieking beneath their weight. Lyra stumbled off, gasping, exhilarated and terrified. We made it, she said, staring up at the endless bands of light circling the city above. You're getting stronger. Kelyuth folded his wings, the glow along his body dimming. Strength is relative. That place, his gaze lingered on the floating fortress, is built on my kin's agony. Lyra followed his stare, unease curling in her stomach. You mean they're still alive? His eyes narrowed, molten gold reflecting the city's glow. Alive, yet hollow. Their fire stripped to power the Dominion skies. They are ghosts that keep humans warm. Lyra's hands tightened around her rifle. The thought clawed at her. She had always hated the Dominion for what they'd done to her colony, but this was cruelty woven into machinery. We can't fight a fortress, she said quietly. Kelyutha's head turned toward her. Then we climb into its heart and unmake it. The plan formed not from strategy, but necessity. Lyra scavenged a stealth module from the carrier's remains, rewiring its cloaking field to mask Kelyutha's thermal signature. They would ascend through the storm tunnels that linked the atmosphere's upper layers to the fortress's maintenance rings. It was suicide, but so was staying still. As dawn bled through the clouds, Lyra climbed onto his back again. The air crackled around them, static bending across his wings. When Kelyuth leapt into the rising wind, the light of the fortress reflected across his scales like fire through stained glass. For the first time, he didn't look small. He looked inevitable. They reached the outer maintenance ring beneath the fortress as the storm waned into silence, the sky glowing faintly with the light of the graviton coils. The air there hummed like a living thing, filled with static and the faint vibration of thousands of engines working in harmony. Lyra's visor flickered with sensor interference, the Dominion's power signatures were overwhelming. Kelyuth crouched low on the cold metal surface, his body cloaked by the stealth field shimmer. Every motion was soundless, every breath calculated. Above them loomed the vast underbelly of Celium, a labyrinth of reactors, hangars, and supply conduits built on the bones of enslaved dragons. Lyra guided them through a narrow service conduit, using old Dominion code she'd stolen years ago from wrecked databanks. Her hands shook slightly as she entered the access commands. The panels responded sluggishly, as if reluctant to open. Inside, the air was sterile and cold, filled with the scent of recycled ozone. Kaelyutha's talons scraped softly against the alloy floor. "This place remembers my kind," he murmured, his voice faint in her thoughts. "And it fears them still." They passed rows of containment cells, cylindrical pods filled with dim blue liquid, each holding what looked like the shadow of a dragon. Lyra froze. The creatures weren't dead, they moved weakly, twitching as conduits siphoned energy from their chests. The glow of their life force was being harvested, fed into the reactors above. Kaelyuth pressed a claw against the glass of one pod, his expression unreadable. The creature inside opened its eyes, recognizing him, and a low hum passed through the chamber, a frequency so deep it made Lyra's vision blur. She had to pull him away. "They can feel you," she whispered. "They are calling for freedom," he answered, voice tight with rage. "They dream of sky even in chains." They climbed higher into the structure, following the central core's rhythmic pulse. Lyra's datapad mapped the reactor network, revealing something she didn't expect. The fortress's graviton rings were powered by the dragon's very essence, bound into a continuous feedback loop. To free them meant to collapse the entire city. To destroy their prison was to doom Celium itself. When she told Kaelyuth, his eyes dimmed. "Then we burn it all," he said simply. Lyra hesitated, staring through the narrow viewport at the cities floating beneath them, human lives suspended on stolen fire. "There are thousands of people up here. Not all of them soldiers." Kaelyutha's wings twitched, metal veins glowing faintly. "And how many of mine burned so they could live?" The silence between them was colder than the steel around them. Lyra knew there was no middle path. Freedom always had a cost. As they entered the reactor chamber, the alarms began to whisper, low at first, then rising. Kaelyutha's scales brightened with power, a living storm ready to break. She met his gaze, unflinching. "Then let's make it count." Together, they stepped into the light, and the fortress began to wake. The alarms became a chorus of metal screams as the reactor's core destabilized, light surging through the conduits like veins of molten lightning. Lyra ran across the trembling platform, her boots slipping on the slick surface as energy pulsed beneath her. Kaelyuth hovered above the reactor well, wings unfurled, his body radiant with power that bled through the cracks of his scales. The entire fortress seemed to bend around him, metal groaning as if in pain. Through the roar, his voice resonated in her mind, not with words, but with calm finality. "It must end now." Lyra's eyes burned as she entered the final override codes into the Dominion console. "If you release all that energy, the fortress will fall. You'll die with it." "I was born from their chains," he replied. "Let me end them." The graviton rings began to fracture, the sky outside turning to shards of gold as magnetic currents spiraled out of control. Through the collapsing chamber walls, Lyra saw the imprisoned dragons awakening one by one, their bodies igniting with reclaimed fire. The air vibrated with the sound of freedom, low, resonant, and terrifyingly beautiful. She reached out toward Kaelyuth as the core flared white. For a moment, their connection sharpened, memories flowing between them like lightning. His first flight. Her first act of mercy. 2 forgotten lives that had found meaning in the wreckage. Then his voice faded, leaving behind a warmth that filled her chest like sunlight. The explosion tore the sky apart. When Lyra awoke, she was falling. The clouds below glowed crimson, the debris of Celium raining around her like dying stars. Her oxygen mask cracked, her limbs were heavy. But something massive swept beneath her, a rush of air, a flash of blue light, and suddenly she was rising again. Kaelyuth soared from the smoke, his wings whole, his form radiant and alive. He caught her carefully in his claws, ascending above the disintegrating fortress. Around them, other dragons followed, newly freed, their silhouettes streaking across the dawn. The Dominion's warships were gone, swallowed by the chaos. The sky, once scarred with machinery, was open again. They flew until the last echoes of the explosion faded, until the only sound was the whisper of wind. Lyra pressed a trembling hand against his warm scales. "You survived." Kale Youth looked back at her, eyes blazing with quiet triumph. "No," he said softly. "We changed." Beneath them, the first light of a new day spilled across Virelia's shattered plains, illuminating the ruins and the reborn sky above. The storm was gone. The chains were gone. And for the first time, the world felt vast again. Lyra closed her eyes and let herself breathe, feeling the weight lift from her chest. She had come here searching for scrap, something to keep her alive a little longer. Instead, she had found flight. Kale Youth's wings opened wider, catching the sun. Together, they climbed higher, past the fading clouds, into the endless blue that once seemed impossible. And somewhere in that boundless silence, she knew the word useless had lost its meaning forever.